And did you know that at one time in English history, murderers feared a legal punishment that was only exacted after death? And that seems pretty odd, doesn't it? Because it would seem like death would be the punishment you were fearing. Like, once they dispatched you by whatever means they were going to use, what more could they possibly do to you? And no, this isn't about the afterlife or your immortal soul. It's not like the Crown could write a letter to God and say, hey, we've taken care of this murderer here. Please make sure he goes to hell. Don't want him somehow slipping through the cracks and ending up in, purgatory, much less heaven. If anything, it seems like what a convicted murderer would most fear besides dying is the experience leading up to it. Like, what are they going to do to you? How bad is it going to be? Because there were all kinds of really unpleasant things they could and did do to criminals, including in the way they executed them. As you can tell by our video title, our time frame here is the mid-18th century. So the full-on Inquisition type procedures were retired, and I think most of us would assume in this time frame, if you're getting executed, you're getting hanged or maybe shot. That being probably more in a military context. So I would say hanging, right? Wouldn't we all assume that would be the predominant method around this time for official executions? And a dying like this would no doubt not be fun, but probably preferable to some of the older techniques. I mean, it's quick at least in comparison. But yeah, the fear of the pain as this is happening, or as whatever method is being employed is happening, that would seem to be the thing to fear second to death itself, maybe first. But that can't matter after you're dead, so what are we talking about here? Well, execution did involve a shame factor as well. This is something that makes the rise of Christianity and its growth into a major world religion one of the more improbable things in world history. It isn't just that the figure at the head of the religion was tortured and killed. No, Jesus was subjected to as shameful an end as there was back there, and this was a part of the punishment. It was definitely and purposely a humiliation on top of the torture and death. So, as an aside here, the cross becoming the symbol of a major religion and its deity, that's like if the same thing had happened to the gallows or maybe the guillotine. So with that method, and I'm sure others, there was this post-death punishment. Like, oh God, I'm not just going to be executed, I'm going to be executed like that. Going to be remembered for being dispatched the way that the lowest of the low are. Come to think of it, and speaking of ancient Rome, I know that at least at one point in Roman history, in their long history, the army punishment for deserters was to first flog them, so you're getting whipped, bloodied up, very painful, but then beheaded. And that was certainly kind of a post-death punishment as well. Like, your body is not going to be intact. You're not getting a proper burial. In a proper burial, not only are you whole, but you might be sent with important items, right? Like this sword here. And this is from a Viking grave. Some of you can probably tell that from the sword pommel. So the beliefs varied a lot and kind of, I think, got diluted over time. But there definitely was an understanding that what happens to your body actually matters in the afterlife. And I don't think this would have been on anyone's mind, not consciously, in the mid-18th century. But deep down, I bet that impulse, that innate association is still a part of why the punishment I'm going to describe was so feared. And even if you didn't believe that you could force a victim to be shamed or incomplete, or importantly, unable to pass on properly to the next plane, then there was still this practice of desecrating the dead to humiliate them. For instance, this story here told by Herodotus about how when the Persians conquered ancient Egypt, the Persian king had the mummy of the Egyptian ruler beaten and then burned. And I'd guess at least that the concept of the afterlife was still a big player in that episode. Then there's some other vignettes like the Pope in 897 had his predecessor disinterred, the corpse put on trial, convicted, mutilated, and thrown into a river. There's a really fun list on Wikipedia that I'm just pulling this stuff from, by the way, so if you're interested in more, look up posthumous execution. A few more. Harold I Harefoot, king of the Anglo-Saxons, pictured here. He died, his half-brother took over, and thought to have the dead king's body exhumed and thrown into a pen with animals. Sir Henry Percy died in 1404. He had a pretty cool nickname too. He was called Hotspur, or Harry Hotspur. And here he is. He was killed in action fighting at the Battle of Shrewsbury, and it's said that King Henry IV wept at first over the loss, but once rumors started getting around that Percy was still alive, the king had the corpse dug up, displayed, then drawn and quartered, the different parts sent to different places for public display. So if you're at the Micklegate Bar, a city gate, then you could see his impaled head. If you were somewhere else in London, you might see his, leg, whatever. And none of this was enough, because later the king had him declared guilty of high treason. Let's do 4 famous ones real quick, because you probably know about these people, but might not know about how they were treated after they died. Thomas Becket's famous end came because he got on the wrong side of his former friend, Henry II. After the fact, in 1538, the king had Becket's bones destroyed. I never knew that. And all traces of his name erased. And we all know a little bit about Vlad the Impaler. He died either via assassination or in battle, but either way, the Ottomans, his longtime foes, cut up his body. It's said sent the head to Constantinople so it could do a nice tour, so people could jeer at it, throw fruit, whatever. You get the point. How about Blackbeard? Did you know that when the British Navy finally got to him, First Lieutenant Robert Maynard cut off Blackbeard's head and had it tied to his ship for the trip home? And then later in Hampton, it was stuck up on a stake in the manner that we've now seen a couple times. It's kind of a, God, we really hated this guy, and he's finally dead. Let's exhibit his head so we can celebrate. And finally, one that is of particular importance to us, and is going to help us transition into our mysterious British punishment. Benito Mussolini suffered the fate all fascist dictators deserve, at least in that he was executed. And his execution was pretty straightforward. He and his few supporters that were trying to escape to the Swiss border were killed by firing squad. So that's pretty humane as far as executions go, you know what I mean. It was machine gun fire too, so you're gonna go pretty quick. But then things got crazy once his body was taken back to Milan, as you can see in this picture, where he is hanging upside down along with his Confederates. But his body was kicked at, beaten, spit on, cursed at. The National World War II Museum's website says that a woman stepped forward and fired 5 bullets into his dead body. Quote, "For my 5 dead sons." And you can easily go online and find up-close, detailed pictures of Mussolini's corpse. I'm not going to show them here because I'm not sure YouTube would even allow it. It's interesting that Mussolini and his Confederates were hung upside down in, of course, Italy. Because, bear with me here, Italy is the place where tarot was invented, and of course one of the major arcana tarot cards is this guy here, the Hanged Man. This being the earliest example we have, mid-15th century. Actually, Mussolini was strung up in northern Italy, and it was in northern Italy where tarot was invented. But regardless, the very angry Italian mob was consciously or unconsciously tapping into a long tradition in their country and elsewhere in Europe. An artistic tradition, but also a real-world execution one. When it was an actual way to kill someone, it was like crucifixion, meant to do 2 things: prolong the suffering and humiliate the victim. This upside-down hanging was a lot more cruel than the standard version of hanging because you're not getting choked to death. It's going to take a lot longer. But for a deep dive on that, see this video of mine on the Hanged Man tarot card. But for the many who don't, and just because I love squeezing in as much related historical material as possible, especially when it's arcane stuff, know that when you see visual depictions like this one here and the next 2 I'm going to show, that doesn't mean there was an actual execution. There was an artistic tradition of defamatory art. Basically, you're such an awful person, we want everyone to know this is what should happen to you. You're trying to publicly shame them in that way, even though they're, for now, safe and sound. And sometimes this could involve weird, gross stuff, if you'll notice the people and animals in this image and the next. Pretty strange, but now let's return to our subject. In both ancient and modern times, you wanted to execute the person for their capital offense. You maybe wanted them to suffer quite a bit, instead of just getting dispatched mercifully. Depends on the method. In both ancient and modern times, you might want to humiliate the subject. For instance, a modern example there being the Mussolini vignette. In ancient times, maybe you wanted to screw the person over in regards to the afterlife, there being a real fear of not being complete or whole on the other side. Or being unable to move on, being trapped here on Earth as a ghost. And there's just one other aspect to tack onto all this, which is, of course, deterrence. As citizens, don't forget you better behave yourself, or you could end up like Pretty Juanita here. And if you don't know who she is or this little piece of American history, you should read my book, Death in Global Folktales. But I think those are all of the ingredients that go into the mix, and that mix was the motivation behind the law that I am now going to unveil, the Murder Act of 1752. Whereas horrid crime of murder has of late been more frequently perpetuated than formerly, and particularly in and near the metropolis of this kingdom, contrary to the known humanity and natural genius of the British nation. And whereas it is thereby become necessary that some further terror and peculiar mark of infamy be added to the punishment of death. May it please your most excellent majesty that it may be enacted that from and after the first day of Easter term, in the year of our Lord 1752, all persons who shall be found guilty of willful murder be executed according to law. And then it goes into a bunch of details, so let's pick it up a little bit later. That the body of such murderer so convicted shall be immediately conveyed by the sheriff or sheriffs to the halls of the surgeon's company, who shall give the sheriff or sheriffs a receipt for the same. So I like that you have to get a receipt for the body, but regardless. And the body so delivered to the said company of surgeons shall be dissected and anatomized by the said surgeons. So having your body donated to science was what was supposed to inspire a further terror and a peculiar mark of infamy to getting executed. Part 3 of the statute specifies that the sentence shall be pronounced in open court immediately after the conviction of such murder, and before the court shall proceed to any other business. And this was done to impress a just horror in the mind of the offender, and on the minds of such as shall be present. Yeah, that's how bad this seemed to people. It just seemed very unnatural to have your body picked apart and cut open and pieces pulled out. Oh, did I mention this could be in public too? Let's read from a book called Introductory Anatomy. In England, Henry VIII granted the annual right to the bodies of 4 hanged felons. Charles II later increased this to 6. Dissection was now a recognized punishment, a fate worse than death. The dissections performed on hanged felons were public. Indeed, part of the punishment was the delivery from hangman to surgeons at the gallows following public execution. And later, public execution of the open body itself. So this was the practice as it led up to the Murder Act of 1752. The thing with that one was they really opened it up. They opened up the floodgates, right? You could do this to all murderers. And this was a boon for the doctors because they needed bodies to dissect to advance the science, life-saving science. But at the time, all of society, not just the convicted murderers, thought it was really disturbing, this whole concept. So the medical schools had a real problem. We had a market inefficiency, and somebody stepped in, as they always will, to try to address that. These were the infamous resurrection men, seen here in a political cartoon of the time. This was a black market in bodies. The resurrection men would dig up dead bodies, without permission, and then sell them to medical schools. But there's only so many murderers that you're going to execute in a given year, and all of them were not dissected even after the passage of the Murder Act. So let's read from the National Library of Medicine, and a very fun work called Harnessing the Power of the Criminal Corpse. In the first 3 decades of the 19th century, body snatching was becoming alarmingly frequent, and the desecration of graves for this grisly purpose was the cause of widespread public disgust and fear. In the 1820s, campaigns by surgeons for access to alternative sources of bodies for anatomical research and training gathered strength. In 1825, surgeons petitioned the Home Office for the bodies of people who died in prisons, workhouses, or infirmaries. But a strong connection had developed between murderers and dissection that created durable prejudice against the use of corpses of innocent people for anatomical work. And the Murder Act was finally superseded by legislation in 1831 called the Anatomy Act. As you can tell, by the way, I cannot get enough of old illustrations of resurrection men. Anyway, what the Anatomy Act did was it opened things up to where any unclaimed body could be used for dissection. A few years before that, a man named Jeremy Bentham was so serious about increasing the supply of bodies that he drafted legislation, which did not pass, called the Body Providing Bill. That was in 1826. Like I mentioned, it failed, but he even went to the trouble of publicly directing that his body be given over to dissection after his death. He was like, hey people, let's get over this stigma. It's not that big of a deal. The Murder Act had also allowed for a practice called gibbeting instead of dissection. And this is where you hang somebody up in a cage, or maybe more specifically, or definitely sometimes more specifically, a body cage, like this creepy looking thing here. And you could execute somebody by putting them up there like that and letting them just waste away until death. But what seems to be the more prevalent practice, especially around this time and related to this law, was sticking the dead body up there in one of these things. Either way, you're enacting this post-death kind of a punishment, one that was meant to instill fear, even on top of the fact that you're going to be executed, and one that plays on those ancient, innate fears that we talked about. Just this general sense that if you don't get a proper burial, or if something bizarre is done to your body, that alone is going to have negative consequences and just kind of seems to go against nature. And in a way, God. Speaking of God, remember earlier in the video I said the government couldn't punish the victim's soul, couldn't dictate matters of heaven and hell? Well, we now see it's a little bit more complicated than that. And it gets much more complicated because the Murder Act, it had a whole raft of provisions that we're not dealing with, things that made it tougher on the convicted. But one I am going to bring up is that they did not allow clergy to visit you so that you could have a chance to get right with God. That really seems fascinating to me. Like, it seems like the government is taking the place of God himself. And it's oddly procedural and literal-minded. Like, you can't talk to a priest, so therefore you can't ask God to forgive you, so you're definitely going to hell. Anyway, this and everything else we've talked about, it was all part of trying to inspire that extra terror that we talked about, to try to frighten people from committing murder. But dissection seemed to hold a particular terror, seemed especially unnatural. And to that point, and to corroborate our claim that this punishment was, at least by some, feared more than death itself, here are the words of Sir Walter Scott regarding the actual announcement of the dissection punishment. Criminals have been known to shrink from that part of the sentence which seems to affect them more than the doom of death itself. And now I'm going to be the first person ever to bring the following into the discussion. Do you know what a pop culture note from roughly the same time is to corroborate these thoughts? Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. It was first published in 1818, and it was a sensation. One of the reasons it became such a sensation amongst readers in the first half of the 19th century is that the monster's origin leveraged these fears that we were talking about. You know, he was put together from different pieces of dead bodies. You're digging up dead bodies, dissecting them, cutting up dead bodies, messing around with them, doing things you shouldn't do. And it's no coincidence that Mary Shelley wrote this around the same time frame that we're talking about now. A time when people were saying, what, they're taking dead bodies and instead of giving them a proper burial, they're cutting them up and pulling the pieces out. At the same time, and on a related note, that resurrection men were running around. Kudos to this artist/studio here. I'm showing the name at the bottom and the top of the image for doing something, a rendition that is much closer to what's described in the book than the classic Hollywood version, which in and of itself is really, really awesome. One of the great, probably movie design successes of all time, just not one that is book accurate. A little unexpected turn there, but tangentially related, as we wrap up talking about the Murder Act of 1752 and its punishment that was feared, at least by some, more than death itself. And with some musings on the traditions and cultural mores that made that so, and even a little bit on the history of execution, especially trying to shame the victim. Thank you for watching.